Okay, and it's back to me for a second. We're now going to turn to the last presentation from Janet Kreda, our senior researcher with CMHC. She's going to highlight some current research that may be of interest to the group. Thank you, Janet.
Thanks, Neil. So I was going to focus on just to do some highlights of some reports that have come out recently or are coming out, and sort of the stay tuned for the publication. So one of those is an analysis of housing choices and changing housing needs. It looked at the determinants of seniors moving into supportive housing, or the choice to move to supportive housing. A follow-up piece, last session you heard about some work on accessory apartment regulations in Canada. We did some follow-up work doing a detailed analysis of those regulations and how enabling or restrictive they might be to creating secondary suites. And then finally, I'll just, if I have a minute, to talk about a report that we just finished that looks at the costs of taking a standard floor plate and making it adaptable for accessibility for the future, which is keenly of interest of making sure that we're creating a supply of housing that actually can be accessible from the start, because the costs to do it at the beginning are certainly much cheaper than doing it to renovate. So that report is actually just come out, so I'll touch on it briefly. So the first one, in terms of the analysis of seniors' housing choices and changing needs, this project had three basic objectives. We were looking at the current pattern with seniors using supportive housing with supportive services, looking at the characteristics of those most likely to choose supportive housing, and also trying to, like I said, understand those factors that determine that choice. In terms of the approach to the project, we had the data source of the General Social Survey Cycle 21, which was a family, social support, and retirement survey that was specifically targeted to those who were 45 and older. So it was a data set that we could look at they asked a number of questions, one of which was, do you live in supportive housing? Would you consider supportive housing, or would you not consider supportive housing? So that was of keen interest to us. And then in terms of a number of socioeconomic questions that they asked, we wanted to see if we could pull out some patterns and some predictive modeling from that data set, which was about 23,000 folks, so a large data set. The project had three components. We wanted to do a pretty robust literature review, then did a sort of a segmented analysis looking at the different age groups, the pre-senior, 45 to 55, 54, 55 to 64, 65 to 74, and then older seniors, just to see what the differences are in terms of their housing choices and when they make those decisions. And then finally, like I said, trying to see if we could do anything on a predictive model in terms of how we could look at the current population and see what those telltale signs might be of those who would be, so we can look more carefully at the supply of supportive housing. The lit review was intentionally broad, not just looking at the move to supportive housing, but late life decisions and late life housing transition. So it was a very broad lit review. And then in the predictive model, what we did was just logistical regressions to look at all the different factors that we had found through the literature review, the ones that we could examine. So going to the literature review, and there weren't any huge surprises, but there's certainly several areas in which we looked at determinants. Those obvious ones are the physical and health, which include physical activity, cognitive functioning, the health of the spouse or the participant, those that require light care and basic functional capacity. We looked at, found things like social and psychological factors, including the desire to reduce responsibility. I don't know about you, but that woman with the rake looks awfully cheerful, and I don't think I'm quite that well-dressed or cheerful about raking my leaves, but certainly home maintenance and the responsibilities of the home and upkeep are major issues in terms of that decision to move. Fear of changes, and loss of your habits and routines, the wanting to live close to family members or live close to the ethnic or cultural community, fear of losing independence, all those types of things are cited in the literature. In terms of demographic determinants, certainly age and sex, education levels, whether you're married or living with a partner or widowed, those are factors that impact those decisions. Other things like the availability of help, so having children living nearby, and I'm sure some of us are experiencing that with our aging parents. And And then other factors also were things like the location of housing choice. So is there an option that's in your neighborhood that allows you to stay in the same neighborhood? The accessibility to transportation and other factors like that. So the literature review covered a number of, including also vitamin D was something that came up on the medical side as well. And so in the literature also we found a conceptual framework in which to organize those determinants and do some of the analysis later in the project. And this was a behavior model that's specifically used in the health field and looking at use of health services. So we did apply this model in terms of categorizing the different determinants I mentioned to you and how they fit into the various categories of either predisposing or enabling and need. And what the model does is sort of show that those are sort of the three categories that work together in terms of determining use of the support services in the future. So predisposing characteristics would be the things like sex or country of birth, Aboriginal status. Enabling characteristics would be things like the marital status or neighborhood, cohesion, availability of support, current housing status, things like that. And then perceived need would be your self-assessment of your physical or cognitive or other health status and those self-perceived needs. So in addition to identifying a number of various determinants that were identified in the literature, some of the themes that came out were not surprising at all. The things in terms of the sufficiency and availability of support in the home, negative shocks, so if a spouse dies or if there's a catastrophic accident or change in health status, those types of things cause a move. Cultural norms and certainly variations, whether with culture, with immigrant status, with ethnicity. And certainly finance is a big one as well, whether you've planned for it or not, and whether you can afford to move, and what those things that affect your financial status are all things that were cited in the literature. So in moving to actually going into the analysis and looking at the general social survey and what we could analyze out of the determinants and what we could actually do analysis on, out of about 47 determinants from the literature, there are only about 27 that were touched on in the general social survey. And what I mean included or touched on, just because the specific element might be captured in some way, but not a specific question. So the survey wasn't designed to get at the specific questions we were asking. So it also, I'll add that of those sort of 27 that were captured in the data, only about 10 of those were specific to supportive housing. So it wasn't a perfect fit in terms of the data set and the types of things that we found in the literature, but it does help give us some insight as to doing future research and what types of areas to be looking at. So that's what we were given. So a number of the things that were included that we could look at are things like availability of the support in the home and physical functioning, so caregiving and receiving those things were asked about. Health status was asked about, proximity of children. But other things that, such as driving status and some things like that, were things that fear of change and those some issues that weren't touched on in the GSS. The next, so when we did the profile analysis, here are some of the things that came out that where we really saw, first of all, in the, I'm just going to flip ahead for a second there. One thing about the sample of from the general social survey is there's a really small proportion of participants that were actually living in supportive housing. This is not too surprising when, in fact, it's related to supply. But there's then a very large chunk that said they would seriously consider, but there's no gradation of seriously consider. So the question was asked, and 60% of people said they would seriously consider supportive housing. But that's quite a big, large, uncertain number about how serious they are about considering. So that's a little bit of an issue. And then 37% said they definitely wouldn't. So when we're trying to profile, we're trying to find sort of differences between these groups. And they weren't strong, but most of the differences were seen in that 75-plus age category, which is when a lot of people do make the decision to move into or change their housing. So some of the things that came out in terms of the group that would be likely to choose or are living in supportive housing, that they're more likely to live alone, that they're more likely to have moved for personal reasons. And personal reasons include to the health of themselves or their spouse, caregiving and receiving or family changes. They were less likely to have moved for home or community reasons, in other words, to upsize, downsize, or change their home because there were too many stairs or to move closer to transit. Those with a spouse are much less likely to consider supportive housing, particularly if their spouse is younger, because they figure their spouse will take care of them. And for immigrants, the older they were when they moved to Canada, the less likely they were to consider supportive housing. So this is intuitively correct. The longer that they've been in Canada, the more likely they are to consider it. So that was not a surprise. In terms of the predictive model, unfortunately, because of the number of determinants, I think the few that were actually specifically related to supportive housing and some of the difficulties with the data set itself, we didn't actually get any smoking guns or really strong correlations. It was really difficult, in fact, to find a predictive factor. And in all, we did a number of iterations and attempts in modeling to try to tease out what might be powerful predictors, and there were none that were powerful. There were certainly a data set that came out that were significant, that showed up over time as being ones we'd want to examine further, but unfortunately we didn't come up with the predictions that we wanted to see. But in conclusion, what it tells us, obviously, it's complex. There are a lot of factors that figure into that decision, and we are going to sort of try to tease out from the data a little bit more carefully what we can learn and what we do know about the different age groups and the different timings of those decisions, and what some of those factors are that we couldn't quite pull out of the logistical regression analysis that was done for this project. And also another point being that qualitative research combined with quantitative analysis, and I think that's what you heard from Jim Dummer earlier too, is that you can do some big quantitative stuff, but sometimes for projects specifically we have a number of complex factors that affect that decision, that really the qualitative piece is something that would really help us to interpret and to make more robust understanding of the data that we found. So the report is in the housing information in the library, CHIC, here, and we will have a research highlight shortly online. Those will be coming, and I will just go quickly to the next project, which is switch gears completely, but it's certainly related on the seniors front because secondary suites and accessory apartments are a big source of affordable and housing, often for seniors and others. So this is, like I said, was a follow-up from research that we did last year, looking at the 498 CMAs that have regulations on accessory apartments. So that was really fun. I'm glad I had a consultant to do that. But 77% of municipalities in Canada permit secondary suites. But what we were interested in is that not all permission is equal. And in many municipalities, when they say it's permitted, there might be the regulations might impose hurdles, or they might be enabling. And what we want to look at is say, what are those factors that are really enabling, and how does that relate to the production of accessory apartments? So there are two parts to the study: one to analyze and go through the specific regulations themselves, what types of caveats or requirements were put on to people who wanted to create suites, and then also the second piece was to see what we could learn from building permit and other municipal data on the types of suites that are being created. So we had two pieces. In terms of looking at whether the bylaws are enabling or restrictive, we seem to be very polarized one way or the other. And in terms of restricted, these are things to say that the creation of a suite is discretionary or required council approval. That was considered to be restrictive. If you only allowed a family member or relation to live in, so the occupancy was restricted in that way, that was considered to be limiting. So that's how we did some of the analysis. In terms of looking at municipality size, there was a correlation between sort of smaller municipalities tending to be more restricted, but this certainly wasn't by any means overwhelming. And there are certainly a lot of smaller municipalities that actually were as enabling as their medium and larger sized counterparts, and certainly not all large municipalities had enabling restrictions. So it wasn't a clear correlation, although it was a trend. Regionally, the regulations in the Atlantic provinces were very mixed, with Newfoundland and Labrador have some of the most enabling regulations, while New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island were most restrictive. The majority in Quebec and the Prairie provinces were categorized as restrictive. In British Columbia and Newfoundland and Labrador, they had the highest occurrence of enabling regulations, while Ontario also had a relatively high proportion of enabling. In Alberta, Manitoba, and New Brunswick had the highest occurrence of restrictive regulations. And I'll pass these out. They aren't published yet, but I would still like to, this is a French, and this is English. This is just it's just the highlights of this study. Again, as I was saying, the typical provisions that we looked at were, the limitations on numbers, the parking requirements, and those types of things. And some of these in and of themselves might be considered restrictive or enabling, but some were considered on a case-by-case basis. So, for instance, parking, if it's in an urban setting, might be considered restrictive. If it's in a more rural or a suburban setting, it might not be. So each of these provisions and each of the regulations was considered and given a rating, and then an overall rating to the regulations. So that's part of it. The full report is in production and should be out soon on in our library. But some of the interesting things we looked at, as I said, the second part of this research was to look at numbers. I have to give a big caveat that we found over 15,000 suites were created over the 3-year period we looked at. This is an incredible underestimate because we had about a 70% reporting rate from municipalities. Of that 70%, not all were complete for the 3 years, and major cities like Toronto and a few other major cities that don't track in a way that we could get numbers aren't included in those numbers. So it is an underestimate, but despite that, it's a good data set. We looked at and asked whether the units were new build or renovation, and I think those ratios are valid because of the sample size. So we know that, while there's many that are new build, a substantial portion are renovations, and that gives us a good insight as to what's happening. And in terms of whether it's a suite that's inside the home or a granny flat or a garden suite that's outside the home, the ratio there is about 86 to 14%. And also what we asked about, what's captured in here is sometimes legalization of suites are captured as a new unit. Sometimes the building permit data and the data we were able to get from municipalities was a bit uneven, but it was certainly a good starting point and gave us a good basis to look about finding a way to do a better model of predicting numbers. And certainly CMHC in our rental market analysis center does do new build. So we are now starting to track new builds through building permits, and that information I think will be becoming publicly available shortly. So anyways, it does give us a better picture, a little bit of insight of what's going out with this part of the market, which is actually a fairly substantial contribution to affordable rental. How am I doing on time here? Okay. So just to sum up on that one, as I think many of you are aware in your communities, the secondary suites have benefits for tenants, owners, and the community, and they're an important part of that affordable housing picture. And certainly as we see housing prices continue to rise and the seniors' pressures rise, and that is certainly an important part of the picture. So we are continuing to look with interest at this part of the housing market. So there's a couple other resources I mentioned on our website on garden suites and on accessory apartments. And I'll just take a few minutes before I close to talk about the project we did on the cost of including accessibility features in newly constructed modest cost houses. And the purpose here was just to explore the incremental costs associated with the inclusion of accessibility features in housing that can support Canadians to live and age at home. The results obtained show that most of the accessibility features generate either negligible or low incremental cost at construction. A small number, however, generate high cost, and that is in a case where you actually need to expand the floor plate or expand the floor plan by a small amount, but that's really where the bigger portion of the cost comes in, is when you actually have to get a slightly larger square footage. Our study was done in 5 municipalities across Canada, and the construction of we did a range of homes: a single detached bungalow, a duplex, a row house, and a 2-story, 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom home. So we looked at all those different types in 5 different cities, and basically found that the construction of the selected accessible and adaptable homes adds an estimated 6 to 12% to the cost of standard construction, depending on the home model and the chosen location. And so in this one, we just took standard models. We didn't take ones that were ready to adapt. So in some cases, there was a little more challenge to achieving those results. But it certainly is very helpful to see where the costs come in and what you can do for basically very minimal cost. And it illustrates that while the costs of adding accessibility features are not insignificant, they could be much lower than amounts needed in the future to adapt relatively inflexible or homes that aren't designed to be flexible. And that's far higher cost when you have to renovate after the fact. And our affordable housing providers can also benefit from the inclusion of cost-effective accessibility features in their projects that allow units to be more adaptable for the future. So it just kind of helps to inform and educate the industry and the sector. So I think that's me.
Okay, thank you, Janet. Is there any questions for Janet?
Seeing none.
Seeing none, okay.
Wait.
Wait.
I didn't get away that easy.
I'm Matt from Manitoba Housing and Community Development. In your research on secondary suites, when the report comes out, is it going to list jurisdictions that have programs that provide financial assistance?
We did identify jurisdictions with programs, but not as part of this report. I do have that information I can send to you. We have that in a separate report that was done as part of the original research. But yeah, so I can send that to you. Yep. I'll look carefully now.
Any other questions for Janet on this most important research from CMHC? Okay, guess we'll move on with the rest of the program.